Peter Bacho, welcome. Good to have you joining us. We appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, guys.
Yeah. Well, this book really seems like it is a labor of love or love letter, really, to your your growing up, with
Hmm.
your community, your people. Uh, when did you decide that this was something you were going to write?
I been out of writing for about 8 years. I'm renowned for writing books that no one reads. And the last book I wrote was Leaving Yesler, which is a damn good book. But small publishers and that sort of thing, you don't have the big money behind you. So I said, writing a book is basically a 3 year enterprise, and getting to the point of dotage, I said, well, I don't know if I have 3 years, too many 3 year spans left. It would be better off, I'd be better off spending those 3 years, those blocks of time fishing or hanging out in bars or figuring out what bets to make on all the upcoming games, et cetera, et cetera. But
Yeah.
the itch hit me about 2018 or so, and I did a short piece, the first one, September 20th, 1968. I don't know if you guys read that particular that particular piece, but it was the first one. I liked it. I liked it. And September 20th, 1968 is the year I turned 18. And as you both know, because I see our gray hairs and so on and so forth. Yeah, that was the Vietnam War, and the draft
Yep.
was on, and Filipino guys didn't go to college back then, and so a lot of these guys from Wapato,
Yep.
Ted
Yeah.
Davina,
Ted
and
Davina.
Vince Messiah, all these guys.
Chris
Well,
Ine, who was killed in Vietnam,
yeah, yeah.
and
Same thing with the
yeah,
Central area and South End. All my pals were disappearing. I was a little bit younger than most of them. I still had senior year to do, and so on and so forth, and basketball season to look forward to, and all of that. But after I graduated in '68, I decided I was going to fool the Army by joining it.
yeah, shrewd move. There you go.
That was the dumbest fucking thing I've ever done in my life. It was so stupid. But I get and so I went to the Army recruiter. I hadn't turned 18 yet, but apparently they were taking any warm body that was out there.
What
And I
year was
said,
this?
1968, in
68.
August
Okay.
of 1968, or maybe it was July of 1968. I signed my papers to
At the
join the
height,
Army
at the height of
at
everything.
the height. And
Yeah.
I didn't. The reason is because all the guys that got drafted, they got sent into the bush.
Mhm.
Friend Ted, my friend Ted, he was so proud of his writing skill, writing and typing skills. And he figured, man, I might get me a cushy job. As soon as he gets over there, they hand him a rifle and tell him to go out and mount ambushes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I signed up. My military occupation specialty was going to be military intelligence. Right, that's a nice air conditioned, or at least they have fans and stuff like that. I typed really, really well. I went to Catholic school. We learned things like that, right? Yeah, I figured my ability to type well and to brown nose superiors would keep me safe for my 1 year in Vietnam. And so on my 18th birthday, my mom didn't know about any of this. My parents didn't know about any of this. They hadn't, I'd been accepted at the UW, but I was scared of the UW. And so you can imagine, I think a lot of the Filipino guys were scared of places like the UW. So such a cold, intimidating place, right? And I figured I would flunk out. And if I flunked out, that's it for me. I'll get snatched up by the draft and given a gun and told to go outside, hike in the woods, walk through swamps, and poop outdoors. And that wasn't something I wanted to do. I really didn't want to do that. I wanted to spend my time in the office, basically civilian job with an Army uniform. That was my goal. And they had a 6-month delay program, right, that I signed up for. That after I flunked out of the UW, which I was planning on happening. Right, I was planning on flunking out of the UW because it's like, oh man, the UW is going to kick my ass and I'll be out, and the draft will grab me, and then it's bye bye mom and dad, and friends and family, and so I'm spending my 18th birthday at the induction center on the other side of Queen Anne Hill. It's down in the valley between Queen Anne and Magnolia.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's bending over and taking tests and signing forms, right? And there was a form that everyone had to fill out. Have you had this, and this? And I said, yeah, sure, I've had asthma. And so I think, okay, well, the day finally ends. But then one of the officers sergeant calls me forward and says, doctor wants to see you. So I go into the doctor's office and I describe it there. He looks benign and kind, like a priest who had sat at the right hand of God. And he looks at me and I sit down and he says, well, I see you've had asthma, which was true. I had asthma as a kid, but, I was basically the picture of adolescent health. I played all the sports in high school, and I thought I'd outgrown it. And he looks at me and he says, that means if you go to a hot, dusty place, there's a chance your asthma might act up. I hadn't thought of that. I said, I don't know, maybe. And then he looks at me like I'm stupid. He says, that means if you go to a... And I said, yeah, he was trying to save my life.
Right.
And he did. And I was just flabbergasted. I had no reaction. I said, oh, okay. And my friend who did go, he says, well, in the Army, we got this saying, sometimes Senor Lucky Dog throws you a bone. And Senor Lucky Dog threw me a bone. That great cosmic joker, Senor Lucky Dog, threw me a bone on my 18th birthday. And I'm still alive as a result.
Well, during that time, a lot of people, even in the military, were questioning what was going on.
Yeah.
So it doesn't come as a surprise.
Yeah.
Because after all, the guy is a doctor.
Yeah.
And in good conscience, it's like, do no harm, right?
Yeah. So. And he did no harm. He saved my life, basically, because I know if I would have gone, I would have ended up like Ted, despite my typing skills.
Yeah, because at that time, as soon as you hit the ground over there, you were given a gun and
all the promises are off.
Yeah.
Well, I think Chris Ine from my hometown of Wapto, and he graduated in '68. I think he was killed actually in action, like just a day or so after he arrived in Vietnam.
There you go.
And so
that would have been the end of me.
Yeah, Peter, you were very lucky. Well, this story that you just told us is in the book, and along with it's a series of essays, and you also kind of coordinate with maps. Tell me that.
Yeah, I wanted to give a visual. That was a last minute addition because Seattle was a red line city back in the 60s. There were certain places certain folks of color couldn't live. You couldn't live north of the old saying was, blacks and Filipinos can't go north of the Mountain Lake Cut.
Wow.
And that was true.
Yeah.
That was true. And
it wasn't just Filipinos.
Yeah. They had restrictive housing covenants and so on and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, Matt. I'm not sure what they called us in those days. Was it Mongols or Orientals or something like that?
Probably Orientals. Back in the valley. I mean, white people called you Orientals. You know, they didn't
Oh,
call you
oh.
Asians. Wasn't, you know, a term yet used or whatever.
Yeah, that
And
didn't come around till the 70s.
yeah,
Asians
right.
didn't come around till the 70s. So
Yeah.
whatever we were, if you weren't white, and you ain't living north of the cut.
Yeah, and if you really think about it, that wasn't that long ago.
Well, this is within our lifetimes.
Yes,
you know?
yes,
It was within our lifetimes. I use the maps basically because I want to give the reader a sense of the physical space that Filipino Seattle used to occupy, for the most part in the central area, to a certain degree in the valley. You know, the projects out there. There are a lot of Pinoys out there, and then some on Beacon Hill. Although that had a lot of Japanese and Chinese people living up there as well, some Filipinos.
So hey, one thing, Peter, one thing, when you say Pinoy, and that is a description of Filipino, someone of Filipino descent, but it's very similar to like Chicano, right?
Because, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And you know, it's used to describe all Filipinos, but that's not how it started out. It was used to describe Filipinos back in the 20s, living in the United States, working with their hands. And there was a class element to that term.
Same thing with Chicano. Chicano was the same type of thing.
Yeah, working with your hands and so on and so forth. A Filipino, particularly one from an upper class in the Philippines, would never, back in the day, would never call himself a Pinoy. That's a fact I point out in my critique of, and it's a glowing critique of Bienvenido Santos's wonderful collection of short stories, Scent of Apples, in which one of these rich kids comes back and refers to the working class guy who helped him out, and now the old guy wants a favor to go back to the U.S. I said, "Oh, that's just a Pinoy. You know, one of those Pinoys I met in the States."
Right.
So it has, there's a class connotation,
right,
as it originally what was applied way back in the day.
Right. But I think our generation really flipped that, in that Pinoy became kind of an accepted term, but one of pride. Same thing with Chicano, because I have a sister that was she graduated from high school in '59 from Wapato, and she said that in her time, her generation, her class, if you called someone a Chicano, those are like fighting words, you know. Yeah. But anyway, you use the maps really to kind of as markers, really.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
We range from, you know, the Catholic parishes in the central area, although some of the guys and girls went to the public schools as well, but an awful lot were centered around St. James, St. Teresa, St. Mary's, and Immaculate, particularly. Immaculate Conception, particularly.
Right. A big Filipino congregation there.
Yeah.
So tell me about Uncle Rico. And the title, Uncle Rico's Encore.
Yeah, well, he showed up after he died.
Oh, really?
Here's the story of Kikoy. He was like my babysitter. He was like a third parent to me. And basically, I was his chosen son. And he would always be coming around, or we'd always go visit him. He's a Chinatown uncle. And he would always be bringing me gifts, and towards the end, I'd get him things. When I was an adult, I'd take him to things with a lot of violence, because he didn't mind violence at all, boxing matches and wrestling shows and that sort of thing. He loved that stuff. I'd take him out to lunch. You know, I'd always made a point to stay in very close contact with this man who I regarded as a parent like he was, you know. My babysitter. And I was living in San Francisco at the time. My mom calls and she says, "You better come up here. Your uncle is dying. I don't know if you can make it." And he was at the VA, because he was First Filipino Infantry Regiment. He got shot up in Samar during the liberation. And I was really broke at the time. We're just hustling between teaching gigs and just trying to put everything together. And I said, can you tell Uncle Rico to wait until the end of the month? That's when I get paid. And I said, don't worry, he will.
Yeah.
And so he did.
Oh, wow.
We drove all night. Once I got paid, I got to the VA, and I kissed him on his forehead. And Winona, who was my wife at the time, wiped the drool from the corners of his mouth. And then we turned around, drove back home. Drove back to San Francisco, told him I loved him. Kikoy always liked my second wife. He thought she was very, very pretty. And I think he reminded her of one of the prostitutes he used to hang out with. Yeah, he was very fond of. Yeah, he's a Chinatown guy, right?
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. People don't understand. I guess maybe it was because of the immigration patterns.
Yeah.
That Filipinos are the majority Asian minority in Washington State.
Yeah.
And people don't get that. They always think like, well, it's Chinese, it's Japanese,
or even Vietnamese now.
Yeah,
right. Or Southeast Asian. Right.
But Filipino, by far and away, is large. It makes up the largest percentage of the population.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, one thing that blew me away was that there are over 4 million Filipinos in the United States. I couldn't have imagined that as a kid growing up in the 60s and 70s. And, I thought the centers of Filipino culture were Seattle, Washington, and Stockton, California. And that's it.
Stockton. Whoa. That's another story. Stockton.
Yeah, Stockton. And that's it. Anyway, back to Kikoy. He always had a fondness for my second wife. I've had 3 of them.
Way to go, Peter.
And he was very fond of her. And we drove back, and it was really hot. And Winona opened all the doors and windows, and she was the manager of the apartment within which we were living. And she was working in a hallway with the door open. Right, the door open because it was one of those kind of dead heat days in San Francisco. It's very rare, but it happened. She saw this. She turned around and she saw this Filipino guy standing in the doorway, young guy, just dressed to the nines, right, like they did in the old days, but 30s, 40s look like. And I'd seen pictures of my Uncle Rico when he had come over in the 1920s, 1930s. I mean, he had those high waist pants and basically zoot suits, right?
Yeah, zoot suits, right?
Yeah. And he was very, very handsome. He had black wavy hair and he had a mustache, right? And so I asked her, and then she glanced up, and then he was gone. This Filipino guy was gone. And she looked down the hall, no sign. And I asked, this is the day after we had visited him, right? I asked, what did he look like? And she described him. He's muscular, handsome, a mustache, thick wavy hair, comb back. And in the pictures, he looked like a movie star. He was that good looking. And I laughed and I said, "That's Kikoy, Uncle Rico. He always liked you. He didn't visit me." He didn't visit me. I mean, his adopted son. He visited you because he liked the way you look.
It's interesting. I grew up, Wapto in the Yakima Valley, where there's pretty good sized Filipino community. Filipino Hall. There's a Filipino Hall that is still there today. Yeah. And a buddy of mine, Ben Tebayuyan, and there was an area where a number of the Filipinos lived, and it was called South Street. It was basically a dirt road, where a number of the families lived.
That's where Ted's family is from.
Yeah, right. The Davidas lived. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I've been to that house.
Yeah, and Ben had an uncle They kind of very similar. And he was called Uncle Flash. And Uncle Flash was just like that, and where Ben had this really close relationship, and he had this old Pontiac, and very descriptive of this. But it seemed like a lot of the guys that I grew up with, they had a relative like that.
Yeah.
And because those guys had come from the Philippines, and started lives here, worked in the canneries. I mean, and they were tough guys during their time.
Oh, they were.
Yeah,
Uncle Rico, even in his 70s, he got into this beef with this young prostitute's pimp. This guy must have been in his 30s. Uncle Rico must have been about 60, in the late 60s, early 70s. And my mom says, "Oh, you need to talk to your uncle." I said, "Why? He's still fighting." He looks at this young guy straight in the face. He describes what happened. He tried to he punched out one other old Filipino guy because he was cruel to rabbits. Right, there were rabbits in the back. In the back, you know that subsidized housing hotel, that motel or hotel that's right on Main Street, South Main.
Mm-hmm.
A big tall brick building. Well, there were rabbits in the underbrush, and then one of them was either a rabbit or a cat or something like that, and he was being mean to one of these little animals. So he tells the other old timer stop it. Then when the other old timer doesn't do it, he punches him out. Well, anyway, Kikoy was talking to the pimp, and he says, "I look at you." He says, "I know you. You can't take me." He says, "You can't take me." This is a 70-year-old man.
Wow. Did he back him off?
Oh yeah, backed him off.
Yeah.
So you can't take me.
Your book really it looks at the community, but also and a community that I think a lot of people don't know about.
Oh no,
but still has a very important history in Seattle, and actually on both sides of the mountains, but really a part of Seattle.
Well, part of Seattle.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and one of the stories, Bad Attitude, I tell the story of ILWU Local 37, the Longshoremen Warehousemen's Union in the 50s. They had a communist labor leader head up that union, President Chris Mansalvas. And this is during the McCarthy era, and they tried to get the rank and file to get rid of him. And the rank and file basically told the federal government to go fuck itself. I'm kind of proud of that. They wouldn't get rid of him.
Yeah,
I'm really proud of that, to be honest. You know, not that I believe in Marxism or anything like that, but Chris was a good union man. He watched out for the rank and file, and that's why they were loyal to him. And I knew Mansalvas pretty well, and people were loyal to him.
Well, Filipinos were instrumental in the labor movement, especially in the Northwest.
Yeah, in the Northwest. Yeah, the union. The union was strong. I mean, it allowed my dad and a lot of other dads to stop being migrant workers because the salaries were better, right? To get off the migratory train. And my mom had something to do with that. Dad had, in the early 50s, Dad had brought us to Walla Walla, Washington. And, you know, I mean, he basically lied to my mom and said he was a big shot and so on and so forth, and brought her over here under false pretenses. And my mom was a very lovely woman. She could have had her choice of anybody in Cebu, any male, and she was being courted. But my dad was, I mean, he was a very physical, confident individual, and somehow he was persuasive enough to get mom to sign on the dotted line and marry him. Well, anyway, you know, his description of life in America was different from her experience of life in America. I mean, we spent the first year on Skid Row, and then LA on Skid Row, Temple Street then. About the fourth year or so, we were in a labor camp in Walla Walla, and Dad was the crew chief or foreman for an asparagus crew. And I can still see the interior of the housing that we were allocated. It was hot, it was dusty, and Mom was crying. And she essentially, I confirmed this with her later on, you convinced Dad to stop being a migrant worker. She says, yeah. Told him I'd take the kids and see you later, alligator. And that's the one thing my father didn't want to lose. Mm-hmm. Well, this is no life for kids.
The Filipinos also were very important to the United Farm Workers.
Yeah.
And there's a strong history there. And also, as you mentioned, with the unions, Somi Domingo and Gene Viernes. Gene was from my hometown of Wapato.
Gene's from your place, right?
He was. But and that also, Gene. Yeah. Gene was a stand-up guy, great wrestler.
Yeah, he was state champ.
Smart, very smart. But the thing about those guys, and because I think that they had seen how their fathers had been treated, and actually they had worked in many of the guys from my high school had gone to work in Alaska during the summer, but they also saw the racism, they saw the bad conditions, and Gene, became a part of that union movement to try to change things. Yeah. They also collided with the Marcos regime.
Oh yeah.
Which ended up actually had a lot to do with why Sylvia and Gene were murdered.
Yeah, that and the fact that Sylvia and Gene were trying to run a clean dispatch.
Right.
Yeah. No money under the table, which is the way things usually were done in the old days. Right. And the dispatch would be run according to seniority, according to union rules. Well, that kind of screwed up the gangsters that killed them because they were newcomers.
Right.
And they couldn't control the rackets and the canneries and make a little bit of extra cash in addition to the union contract.
So in writing this memoir, because it's really looking at your life and the people around it, what do you want a reader to get out of it?
This is I was visiting. This is a long response to a question, but that's kind of the way I roll. But I think I was visiting with Larry Alcantara in the VA this past Sunday, and I read him a passage. I read him a passage. He's hospitalized. I read him a passage that included him. And as I was driving away, I realized that one of the reasons that I lived to the point that I did live long enough to write this memoir was because I was intended to. This is the most, no doubt in my mind, this is the most important work I will ever write. I might sell out later on and just write stuff for money. That's why.
Well, you got to make a living.
Yeah. Supplement all the different little incomes, right? But this is the most important work that I will ever do. And every community, every generation needs a griot. And I guess that task falls to me. And I'm halfway persuaded, maybe all the way persuaded, that I've lived as long as I have and was able to write this because I'm kind of the designated griot of this community, this generation, these two generations. Someone needs to tell the story.
What is a griot?
The historian.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's... unless I've mispronounced it, I think it comes out of Africa, in which the oral histories are passed on.
Right.
Every village, every group has someone who knows, or maybe more than one person who knows what that history is, and it gets passed on. Well, this is a history of a particular time and of a particular group in a physical location. And it's not just a story of me and my family. Although, my deep affection and loyalty to my mother obviously stands out, my parents and my uncles. But it's also the story of other families, the people who made up this very unique community.
and in a community that really was tight.
Very tight.
Well, in many ways continues to be, but it's probably more dispersed now.
It's,
but
yeah. I don't feel the sense of community.
Right, because it's sort of like what's happened to the Central District and the gentrification and all of that. But and I relate this to my own community, the Mexican community where I grew up, because they had to have each other.
Yeah.
Because that's how they existed, just to be able to exist, to know how to deal with the system, to how to deal with just getting your kids through school, getting them out of trouble, all this stuff, because they were immigrants, and you depend on you're hoping that your kids will have the opportunity to then go on and have a better life here. I always find, just the fact that my parents, coming from Mexico, how in the hell do you do that? It's just to me, it's amazing. But that's what this does, I think. And I think you're right.
Hopefully, this is the most important work I will ever do. Period.
Yeah.
Peter, why do you think, just in the general culture that exists now, that why Filipinos aren't recognized more for the contribution?
To a certain degree, the younger Filipinos are ahistorical. I mean, they're ahistorical. They don't pay attention. They're not curious. And I've said this before. I think I was interviewed once by Filipinas magazine. and I think the interviewer asked me, is it, in terms of young Filipinos, was there anything that I thought that they did well? And I said, well, they sing and dance well.
It's interesting because in Seattle specifically, right? They have that kiosk that is dedicated to, I guess, I don't know what they call it, but Filipino town or whatever.
No, that's the Jose Rizal Park. That's right. That's the
but there was a kiosk in right off King Street there.
Yeah,
and a few years ago they actually removed it.
Yeah.
Because some people in Chinatown didn't want to recognize it and says, well, that shouldn't be there. And then there was a big thing and they brought it back.
Yeah.
But the fact that it was shocking to me is there was a long period of time, where Filipinos were the dominant culture in Chinatown. That's in the CID.
Particularly during dispatch season and the return from Alaska. Literally hundreds, if not thousands of Filipinos. And we'd always go down to welcome Dad's old friends, my parents' old friends. They come up from Alaska, Oregon, wherever they were, or not from Alaska, but from California, Oregon, wherever. And
but you look at the Milwaukee, the Republic, the Alps. Those were all occupied by Filipinos. I mean,
and also the battle over the kingdom really had to do because of the housing for many of the elderly Filipinos that were still
and it was the Filipinos that spearheaded that effort.
Right. Like Bob Santos and others that were part
Frank
of that.
Irigan.
Yeah. I've got a section on that and I was part of that group, and I said, forget the kingdom. I said, what we need to do is get adequate housing for these old timers, and we won through the march on HUD, a couple hundred people, the effect of Mauing, and Bob's working the system. Bob was key to all of this. Bobby was key because young people could act crazy, and so the people who made the decisions, they felt that they needed an intermediary, and Bob provided that, and there was work at interim. He was able to basically get housing for all the elderly residents, those who wanted it, decent housing.
Mm-hmm.
We're not just talking about hot plate rooms or anything like that, but decent housing for the elderly residents of Chinatown. Bobby was crucial.
Yeah. Well, there was basically some internal strife between, I think, those Chinatown and over who represented Chinatown, International District. And I know that Bob was kind of at times,
Bob was always walking a tightrope on that.
Right. Because you had the Chinese community, which felt, really
well,
the strong
and the Chinese community
ownership.
represented by Ruby Chow, right?
Right, right, yeah. And you forget the fact that that Filipinos had a huge impact on that community as well. So there was that internal thing. It's probably, I guess it's less so now because maybe just the change in generations and things like that.
There's a change in generations, and the Filipino role in Chinatown. I don't think there are any Filipinos left in Chinatown, to be honest. And that old generation is gone.
Yeah, I think that's
it's mostly there's lots of Chinese and Southeast Asians now as well. But that's what happens over the course of 3-4 decades, is that demographics change. I understand that, I accept it. And for me, what's important about this place are the memories.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, so currently, what do you think of the state of the CID? I mean, we went through this whole thing where we pushed back on the mega shelter. We're currently in the process of fighting back the transit station. I mean, there's always seems to be some existential threat to the community, but
it always is.
Where do you see it now?
Chinatown is always going to be dumped on. I mean, I remember in one of these town meetings in which the county project manager, who's managing the Kingdom, and was holding a public hearing in Pioneer Square. And I got up and I says, isn't it true that the reason that the county picked this area is because the people here are too powerless to resist? And he said, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yes. Okay. So I said, okay, well, that's an honest answer. We got work to do. And we did. Mm-hmm. Fought the Kingdom, didn't win that battle, but we won the more important one, which was to get housing for
housing and then the health clinic.
Services.
Yeah.
And services for our elderly. And so we won that one. I mean, not just Filipinos benefited, but all residents of the ID benefited as well.
Matt was just involved in this whole effort regarding the homeless shelter.
Yeah.
And the community came together there.
Yeah, because
I mean, it was the whole community.
Because we didn't pose it as NIMBY, right? It was like, this is yet another stone in that wall of injustice.
Yeah, I agree. Chinatown's always going to get dumped on. But there was a period in time in which it wasn't dumped on. And that's because there was representation on the city council. And powerful representation, whether you're talking about Dolores as council president, or there are other members as well who are Asian, and Bobby running into them. Bobby was like a hawk, but he's no longer there. And I mean, he was like, "Oh, don't mess with my neighborhood."
Well, Sorry. It was his presence, I think, along with the rest of the Gang of Four. They were very unique.
They were very good. They were very good.
Yeah. So it's finding that again.
The demographics of the country, especially in Seattle, is that, brown people are almost the majority. If people would understand just joining together, the power that would have to get stuff done, but everybody's splintered, right? Social media, they cancel each other. Others are driving their Teslas around. I mean, they don't understand the common cause of what needs to be done.
And that's why the Gang of Four was so important.
Before we wrap things up here, one thing I want to cover is the fact that you had a very close relationship with your mother.
Yes. And
in the book, you sort of write this kind of very heartfelt remembrance of her and all of that. And I think that's actually all of us, our moms are probably the most important thing, because our dads are off working. And
that's true.
And the guys of our generation, it wasn't until my dad was probably in his mid-50s to 60s that he ever showed much affection. And then he really changed after that. But your mom and Filipino moms in general, what do they mean? And what did she mean to you?
I was very fortunate to have Remy Abella as my mother. She could see the absurd. She had a sense of humor. She was whip smart. She was kind, and she stood up for what was right. There's a story in there in which two Filipino maids had escaped the Philippine embassy, the consulate here in Seattle. This is back in the 70s. And I see them. I go by the house, and there are these two Filipino middle-aged, late 30s, early 40s, sleeping on the floor of our living room. I said, "Who are these?" And it had been in the paper that these Filipino women had been abused by the Philippine consulate. This was during Marcos's time, so I mean that's a very dangerous step to take, and no one would give them shelter. So Father Ocaña at Immaculate called my mom and said, "Would you take them in?" She says, "Yes, of course I'll take them in." No one else would step forward, and I wrote in there that this is the proudest I've ever been of you. That this is a moment of for providing me this moment of crystalline moral clarity. That was Mom.
Yeah. Hey, she sounds like she had a lot of guts.
Yeah, she did.
So, Peter, this book, I think, is, I hope that people will take the time to read it because it's got such important history. But I also think that there's this emotion and attachment to it that I think is so important, and particularly for young Filipinos and other people of color to read and to relate. Is this any more books coming?
Nah. Scripts will be fun. That'll be fun. It's like it's less work. There's less of an investment, I suppose. In writing scripts, but at some point in time, I only write in terms of major writing projects, such as this one. I only write if the muse is there and if I love the project. This is what I tell my student writers. If you're going to write a book, make sure you love it, because if you don't love it, you're not going to finish it.
Yeah,
or it's going to end up half baked. I love this one. I love this the most of all. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's the most important work I've ever done. And if I don't write anything more, in terms of books at least, I'm fine with this one being the capstone.
All right. Peter Bacho, thank you so much for taking the time. The book is called Uncle Rico's Encore. It's, as I said before, a love letter to Seattle's Filipino community that Peter Bacho was a big part of and raised him. And fortunately, he's been able to be the griot who has captured all these stories to give back to the community. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Enrique. Thanks, Matt. I enjoyed just the conversation. It was just fun.